Okay, this video is going to take us through page 11 of our Chapter 2 notes, and we are going to be dealing with the JOptionPane class, and we're going to use what's called dialog boxes. And so what we have here is we have code that we're going to demonstrate here. And you can see the code here, so it's got some stuff that we haven't covered yet. And so before we go into it and discuss it, we are going to take a look and see what this code actually does. And so just as we're looking at this here, here's the code in JGrasp, and so it's been compiled. Now we're going to run it. So, but before we do, let's just take a look here. Notice it's going to ask for the user to enter the customer name. It's going to say enter the customer number, enter the cost of the order, and then it's going to display that information here and tell the user thank you for eating at Moe's. And so it's going to do all that. Whoops. And so let's take a look. So we're going to run it. And so this right here is a dialog box. So enter the customer name. So let's say the customer name is Sally Sue. She's everywhere. And then we go enter the customer number. So let's say something. Customer number. Okay, actually I should say order number. So I don't know what happened there. So order number, let's say it's 24. So think of yourself as being at a burger joint, and they have customer numbers that they call out. Number 24, number 24, and the cost of the order is, let's say, $24.36. And so we're using dialog boxes to do all this. Everything is happening in a dialog box. Even the display here is in a dialog box. And then, thank you for eating at Moe's, dialog box. So that is what's going on. That's what we're going to be using here. So for the first thing, let's go ahead down here to number 1. Number 1, the JOptionPane class allows the use of dialog boxes in our programs, and that's what I just demonstrated. So it allows the use of dialog boxes in our programs. Now a dialog box is an example, and I'll type it up here, and it'll turn up in, well, no, this is, let me see if I can go like that, is an example of a graphical, okay, I did want to have this red. User interface. Oops. Okay, so this is called, it's an example of a graphical user interface. Now, interface, all that means is when it's like being able to communicate with another person. Interface, like face-to-face. It's a communication between two people. And this is the way the computer program communicates with the user, and then the user also interacts with the program through this dialog box. And so if you remember, the dialog box asks the user for input. In that dialog box, the user was able to type input and hit enter, and so there was that communications interface. Graphical just basically means that it's an image, it's things like icons and pictures and things like that are graphical. And so that's what we're using to relate with the computer. And so, or make the computer relate with other people. And so the dialog box, okay, and another thing you can put in there is it's got an acronym, GUI, G-U-I. It's pronounced GUI. And so you might hear somebody talking about a GUI. Well, they're talking about a graphical user interface is what they are. And there's other types as well. JOptionPane requires an import statement. An import statement. And so that import statement is right here. This is something that you want to make sure that you don't copy and paste when you write these programs. You want to type it out until you memorize it. So it's pronounced, it's import javax.swing.JOptionPane. The name of the class is always at the end, and the JOptionPane class allows us to use dialog boxes. JavaX is how it's pronounced. And so the other thing is that we use the blank method to get user input. Now, what is that method? Now, before, what we did is we used to use, or what we have done in the past, is we used 2 lines of code to get user input. We would write the prompt in a print statement, enter customer name, and then we would get a part of the code here in this line is to read the code, and so, or read the input, and that's from, of course, the word scan means to read, so it reads what the user says or types in, and then this assignment operator tells us it's going to assign that input into this memory location. Okay, so now what's going to happen here is we have code that is going to be JOptionPane class .show input dialog, and in this dialog it's going to do a couple of things in this dialog method. It's going to, first of all, it's going to take this prompt and it's going to incorporate that prompt in here. Then it's going to take the part of this code here that's reading the input. Well, this is going to also read the input because the dialog is built into the dialog box to recognize what the user typed in that dialog box. And so, so I typed Sally Sue in the input dialog box, and then that dialog box is set up so the compiler can actually read what the user typed. Now then we have the storing here into the variable, which is also on this same line. Okay, and on top of that, it's also declaring the variable. So this one line does everything. And so it's kind of a nice change. It does make for some long lines of code, but it is a little bit more efficient than what we're using at this point. Now, we're not going to change and do everything in dialog boxes, but we do have that availability. So what is the method? The method, remember, it comes before the user, or before parentheses. And so just like up here, we have a parentheses here, set of parentheses, and we call this the main method. And the name of the method is right before the parentheses. The same thing happens here. This is a set of parentheses here that's going to indicate that we have a method. And the name of the method is right before it. And so that method is called show input dialog. Show input dialog. That is the method. And that's going to be the method that's going to be used to get user input. Now we have another method that's going to be used to display a message, like you've been using our print statements for. Well, so you see here, here's the summary of the order. Well, we have been using print statements for that. But instead, we're going to take this method right here. Here's our method. Here's the set of parentheses. The name is right before it, and it's called show message dialog. So this is the name of the method. A method has a purpose. The show input dialog method prompts the user for input and reads it. And the show message, it's just all that does is its function is to display the message in a dialog box. Okay, then we go on to number 5. It says blank is the first argument of the show method message dialog method. And so what happens here is, here's the show message dialog method, and here's the first argument is null. The next argument comes after a comma, so commas separate arguments. The next argument is what we are used to having in our print statements. which this, of course, is a concatenation. So typically, we have a print statement that has one argument. That's a concatenation usually. And now, though, we have another method, show message dialog, that has two arguments. Null is in the first one, and the concatenation is the second argument. Then, let me see here. And null, though, is not required when using the show input dialog method. So up here, we're not going to go null, comma, and do that. Now, you could, if you did do that, the program would work just fine, and everything would be fine and dandy. But you don't need the word null in the show input dialog method. The next thing is the compiler reads all user input from dialog boxes as a certain data type. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this and notice that we used, here it says enter, and I'm going to change this now, an order number. And the order number that's a regular number, like an int. And so we would want to put an int here. But we're going to see what's going to happen if we do that. Here's the cost of the order. Well, that's a decimal. So, well, why is this a string? So we're going to put double, though, because that's what we want to do. And we're going to see what's going to happen because of that. And so what happens is we take this and we compile it. And let's see what it says. It says that in line 8, so it's yelling at us in line 8 because we put an int here. So it says incompatible types. That's data types. A string cannot be converted to an int. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you ask the user to enter an order number, and let's say the user enters a 24, then we said that we want to store the user input in this memory location. So we're trying to take a 24 and store it in a variable or storage location that is an int. Okay, so we're trying to store it here. It's an int, etc. Okay, now the thing is, this says, well, you're trying to store a string actually in an int. It says string can't be converted to an int. So they're actually suggesting that 24 is a string. It's numeric data, but it is treated like a word. It's a string. And we're trying to store the string in an int. That's not going to work. So, here's our conclusion. The conclusion is that the compiler reads all user input from dialog boxes as strings in number 6. Even if the user types a number or like a whole number or even a decimal, they're read as strings. So what does the compiler say if you try to store user input in an int, a numeric data type? I should have said this different. I should have said, what does the compiler say if you try to store a numeric string into a numeric data type? So a numeric string is a number that's being treated like a string. And so what we said was the error message, what you want to make sure that you write down, is it says the error message is incompatible types. That's the main part of the message. And then string cannot be converted into an int, or strings cannot be converted to a double. So incompatible types, string cannot be converted to numeric data, essentially is what it's saying. All right, let's get rid of this. And so make sure you have that in your 6A. Now, notice the use of the escape sequence. which is for /n. It's used. Let's see what it's used for. So if we look at this, just a really quick reminder, if I can change this to a string, compile it and run it, and we go Sally 25 12.45. Okay, so we have in this dialog box we have the order written, and so what happens here is and we've learned this before, so here's concatenation. It says order number and it gives the order number, and then it has, before it prints customer, it says go to the next line down. So after this it goes down to here, and then it types customer and then the customer name, and then it says go to the next line down, so that's going to go here, and then it's going to say now print cost of order, blah blah blah. And so that's what it's doing. So what this does is this creates multiple lines within the same dialog box. But the important thing to see here is, well, what if we didn't have that escape sequence? Well, this is what it would look like. So we have Sally 24 36.44, and so you see how ugly this looks. It's hard to read this. So this is an advantage and a efficient use of the escape sequence for going to the next line. Alright, so it's used to create multiple lines within the same dialog box. Alright, so that covers it for the JOptionPane. And use this example and your notes to do tonight's homework. And there you go.